We'll wait for 5 minutes and then start. Hello, I am Neil and I go by she or her pronouns, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the second and final day of Delicious Desires, Queer Foodways in South Asia, a first of its kind conference to link India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh on matters of food and queerness. We had a wonderful first day exploring food histories and food cultures, and the queer possibilities and the queer experiences that bind them. And today we will move on to more deeper and diverse connections. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce the fabulous speakers for today's first panel, Chris M. Kurian and Madhura Lohokare and Maniza Khalid. Chris's day job is to teach public health, but her creative passions lie in cooking and to think about food politically. Under the name Fork Songs, she has run a home kitchen and food stalls, designed menus, and undertaken catering assignments. Madhura Lohokare, on the other hand, has a fraught relationship with food, is a trained anthropologist, invested in developing critical writing pedagogy. Maniza Khalid manages programs and innovations at, can you hear me? Yeah, I think you can hear me, right? Okay. Sorry, I got cut. Maniza Khalid, who goes by she or they, manages programs, innovations at the Queer Muslim Project, which is, of course, South Asia's largest virtual network of queer, Muslim, and allied individuals. Maniza is a postgrad in English and a queer witch. Their practice is informed by pleasure politics, pre-Islamic goddess worship, and radical kindness as a tool to propel social transformation. And so I'm very excited to have you all three here for a panel called Nourishing Practices and Disruptive Strategies. And thank you for accepting our invitation for the same. Now, before we begin, a quick rundown on the format. There will be 15 minutes presentation from each side, following which I will pose a question and we will end with a Q&A from the audience. And so for those of you who are tuning in, please post your questions using the Q&A feature in your Zoom screen. And we'll try and get a few of them in the last leg of the session. That's that, and whoever wants to begin first can start. Chris, Madhura, do you want to go first?
No, we can do that.
Great.
Okay. I need to share PowerPoint, so let me just share my screen. Yeah, share sound. Is this visible? If you can just
Yes,
let us know. Okay. Yeah. All right. Fantastic. Okay, should we begin? All right. Hi, hi everyone. My name is Madhura.
Hi, and I'm Chris.
And we are delighted to be here this evening. There is some excitement and some trepidation because putting together this presentation has been an exercise in a creative stock taking of our life together and sharing it in a public forum the first time ever. As middle-class women embracing a queer identity in our 40s, through the story of our relationship with food, we also cast light on this trajectory of queerness in the making. We hope this experiential telling will contribute to validating and recognition of diverse journeys to queerness.
In this presentation, by taking you through dimensions of the everyday performance of our relationship, we dwell upon two distinct threads that illustrate how our practices of food and our queer identities were mutually constitutive. Our engagement with food helped ground us in an intersectional understanding of our identity, of labor, informed by our caste and class locations. Food has played a role in cementing our identities as queer women to the outside world. And it has been an easy gateway to experiencing different kinds of families, belonging, and safety. Towards the end, we gesture to the possibility that the discourse of food as an enabler of queerness might need to account for the ways in which it might reinforce heteronormative and gendered ways of being in same-sex relationships between women.
Come from caste and class positions where food does not trigger generational memories of want or humiliation. It is important to acknowledge that our love for food as a creative enterprise, as a thing of pleasure, plays out in a context where food has been and is increasingly becoming an axis of deprivation and violence.
We begin this thread with dry and fry. The golden Karela roundels sit in the steel thali waiting to be dehydrated in the merciless June sun on the terrace of our one-bedroom Barsati in South Delhi. Rub the salt, turmeric, and chili powder onto the Karela slices, steam them, put them out on the terrace. Cover them with the gamcha and let the sun dry the shit out of the Karela, as Madhura loved to say. We did several rounds of dry and fry with Karela and Kundru in the summer of 2013, the year we got together. Excuse me. And dreamt of having dry and fry summer afternoon parties where folks got their own vegetables and learned to dry them on our truck, following which we would party with a pot full of khichdi, beer, and some fried Karela from our earlier lot.
We wanted to make a home together so much, and we wanted to make it literally with our own hands, much as we had seen our mothers do. No surprise then that we continued to dry and fry into the later years of our relationship, a constant reminder of what we brought from our lower middle class homes. Memories of my mother in my nuclear household drying stuff on our building terrace in Pune, of the distress of not being able to buy ready-made potato chips because अगं आपण घरी केलेले आहेत ना, कशाला उगाच बाहेरचे महागडे घ्यायचे. It hardly felt distressing now, though, to replicate the dry and fry as we scripted our own romance. We lived our middle classness unabashedly together, re-signifying it in delicious ways by taking it out of its stifling heterosexual context of mother dries, mother fries, children eat, father watches TV and doesn't even notice the fries. Middle-aged us, no longer middle class us, but still kind of middle class us, drying and frying, romancing on the terrace, maybe sharing a beer and a quick kiss before heading inside to stir the ghee ki sabzi.
We call the second part of this thread grinding of another kind. The coconut scraper, like other old world cooking tools, held me in thrall as a child. When visiting Kerala from Delhi in my summer holidays, I'd be fascinated by my aunt sitting on the low block of wood, their legs to one side, housecoats held in place modestly, both hands grasping the coconut half and grating it with practiced energetic rhythm, carrying on a conversation as scrapings felt soundless like snow into a steel plate. The little me saw in their labors the grace of a grown-up womanly efficiency, a quality I yearned to possess. Raised in Delhi, my lack of an authentic knowledge of coconut, like other things emblematic of Malayaliness, had over the years made me the object of ridicule and reprimand by my extended family for my moral failures as a Malayali and later as a woman, for being too city-bred and not rooted enough.
peculiar sound to the coconut flesh getting scraped as you turn it on the grater with a practiced rhythm. Beads of sweat gather on the upper lip. The right shoulder starts to feel the strain of the rhythmic grating with just enough pressure to grate, but a simultaneous controlled movement to prevent your finger from splicing open on the grater. The lower back begins to hurt, having stood awkwardly bent over the grater. Grated coconut heaps up on the plate, eventually making its way into a steel dabba to be stored in the freezer. All's well with the world when that happens. The last few years are replete with our memories of grating, grinding, squeezing and pressing, churning out freshly ground coconut or coconut milk for our usals and torans, for our Onam sadhyas, for our stall menu.
When I saw the coconut scraper in Madhura's home, I felt recognition, not of her home, but of her. I knew I'd found someone who understood the contradictions held in the fascination for the rhythms of womanly expertise being shaped at that scraper, and the simultaneous refusal to be caged by the heteronormative narrative that stake claim on that expertise and beauty in service of patriarchal expectations.
Our queer household's love for coconut also forces us to be aware of our location. Pure physical labor and time involved in producing a dabba of grated coconut continues to push uncomfortably against the glossy Instagram food we showcase and through which we lay claim to cosmopolitan brownie points. It reminds us that good food and good looking food is produced through backbreaking, invisibilized labor of women, of working class and Dalit Bahujan people. Our intimate familiarity with grating the coconut notwithstanding, we can and do now often outsource the coconut grating to Anju, our domestic help. The knowledge of this caste and class privilege sits uncomfortably alongside the exquisiteness of a mutton stew made in coconut milk or of the perfectly balanced coconut and coriander chutney. Every time we turn our noses up at coconut powders and tint coconut milk, it forces us to reckon with the realization that woven in our romance of hand-grated coconut are also the streaks of our upper caste middle class markers. But also, every time we grate or grind the coconut on our own and feel the satisfying squeeze in pressing out the coconut milk, it connects us back to the mixed upness of food with labor, body, and the immense punning possibilities of this marvelous thing.
The second thread of our narrative revolves around food and building new families. We start with creature comforts. Emotional safety became the axis of life when I chose to rebuild it with Madhura in the years following my divorce. For about 3 years, as I kept to myself and on the margins of social life I had once been part of, I found my gaze drawn to beings that counted in minimal ways in city life. I'd see cats everywhere, slinking past parked cars and metal gates, on trees and distant terraces. I would constantly hatch schemes to lure them into adopting our home and hopefully us, putting out bowls of milk and occasionally eggs. Cats were inspiring in their ability to hold beauty, vulnerability, and affection while establishing emotional boundaries without apology. There was a lesson in there for two women building a home together in a world that was likely to invisibilize them. Once our household had regular feline visitors, feeding them well became an important consideration. We'd boil chicken with turmeric, serving it cold in the summer and with warm broth in the winters. We tended to several cats in illness and injury, building shelters for them on our balcony, keeping the sun and wind out with cardboard, curtains, and blankets. Before we knew it, our balcony had turned into a veritable cat nursery, swamped by an army of kittens, mounting the grills on our main door, clamoring for food through incessant meows. In time, we adopted some of them. One moved in of her own volition, found homes for others, and dealt with deaths and accidents of a few. Winning the trust of these vulnerable creatures was an important prize in my universe.
Our kinship with cats is probably the most stereotypically lesbian thing we have. Although who knew we were doing lesbian? We don't quite use that label for ourselves, but who knew we were doing lesbian as our household was being catified in search of new coordinates of safety and nourishment. As the unwilling partner in this endeavor to build community and gather cats and plants and people in our household, it is the cats who I have come to accept most unconditionally, with love of the kind that makes the heart ache. A few months after we lost Kittu, our beautiful, foolish, anxious dear cat in 2021, Chris made her famous chicken curry as a way of remembering Kittu, given Kittu's love for chicken. We shared it with friends who had been with us through the period of loss. We sponsored a meal for animals of Friendly Coast Shelter in her memory. The sharing of food with humans and animals in this context coalesced many threads. It tasted of grief, memory, and nourishment. It tasted of a different family.
We end with recipes for complicated lives and loves. Our early days together were marked by our shared love of utensil shops and vegetable mandis, visiting neighborhood parks in spring to return with mulberries and nasturtium leaves, reveling in each other's discoveries. My delight in Amti and Davangare dosa in Pune, or Madhura encountering every conceivable animal on my family's Easter plate in Kochi. It was a reaffirmation of life, of pleasure. A new romantic relationship, however, wasn't enough to offset the baggage of abandonment and invisibility that followed the collapse of a decade-long marriage. A return to normalcy also meant being restored to a community. The lingering unsafety following my divorce was amplified by the real and imagined dangers of the limited social acceptability of our relationship. Madhura's right-wing Hindu Maharashtrian Brahmin family, refracted through my existing fears, only appeared more daunting to the Malayali Christian in me. For middle-class women choosing same-sex relationships, there is strength in numbers, I reasoned. Building community was the answer to our frailties. There was an urgency of finding allies who aspired to freedom while sharing worlds shaped by a hybridity close to ours, of lower middle class, rural origins, and leading urban migrant lives. We inadvertently sought solidarities along the axis of this hybridity in the absence of a queer register recognizable from our location.
Chris, our fledgling relationship was framed within a sense of impending danger of frailty. For me, as someone who had long grappled with their queerness and sexuality, it was the merry-go-round ride that I had patiently waited my turn for. Here was love at last, the imminent realization of my sexual self, and the pink, not rainbow, bubble of romance that awaited us. The need to be a validating partner translated into going along with Chris's project, unable to recognize my needs or the contours of my queerness.
We did find takers for the hybrid world we celebrated. We found them primarily in younger, mostly cis heterosexual women and a few cis men. Some who were new to the city, navigating the metropolis and competitive careers while juggling parental anxieties with independent living and difficult loves. All of us united by our need for democratic relationships of care, a respectful exchange of insight across hierarchies of age. Our home and kitchen became an oasis of sorts where friends gave themselves up to the gentleness of Stai Sadam to recover from an awkward work party, nestle in the comfort of khichdi and garelu cotton sheets while recuperating from a fibroid removal, or spend a day post a chapter submission to tuck into familiar meals otherwise elusive in Delhi: rice, morgari, fried fish, thoran, koshambir, and mirhund. At Diwali and Christmas, we'd feast on food cooked to recipes that I'd learned from friends and their mothers, from blogs and cookbooks, food belonging to specific places and peoples, but shared with everyone around our table. Adai avial, fried sole, kuttu ki puri, tomato tarts, and hot pots. We and our home became synonymous with food. It became an easy register through which the world around recognized us as a queer couple because of our ability to think, speak of, experiment with different kinds of families. Food being a chief conduit to forge bonds of care and collective pleasure in these chosen families. A happy tangle of kin, including cats, plants, and dogs, friends turned cat godmothers, and cat masses and family turned into friends.
Queering of our kitchen, or the joys of women feeding women over intense conversations and raucous laughter. So the queering of our kitchen and kinship through practices related to food was no doubt constitutive of our identity, but only partially.
I love the craft of cooking and its labor, but I also found myself hemmed into a caregiving role. While it consolidated the ground beneath my feet, the emotional labor began to feel burdensome given the challenges of negotiating boundaries in a terrain devoid of blueprints. The labor alienated me further from my sexual body and also from this relationship.
My own fraught relationship with food and my reluctant participation in our initial community building venture limited how I realized my queerness via this route. We expected that doing queer would come to us naturally. After all, we were being led by feeling. But coming from a context where an affirming discourse of queerness was decidedly absent, and where we knowingly and unknowingly worked within the grammar of heteronormative references, outside of the space of kitchen, food, and community, how were we to queer ourselves in our relationship? As we recalibrate our ways of being together, we want to reinstate the sensuous and sensory joys of food in their rightful place in our relationship, as a conduit to pleasure and romance, and not a stand-in for them.
Achieving queerness has diverse, uneven trajectories as complex as umami and as delicate as the perfectly constructed melt in your mouth pan. In narrating the place of food in our household, we recover the pleasure and acknowledge the pangs of achieving queerness and provide a home for these fraught journeys.
देख जरा इस ओर सांवरिया देख जरा इस ओर देख जरा इस ओर सांवरिया देख जरा इस ओर सांवरिया देख जरा इस ओर.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, you just took my heart. What a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. And especially, like the line when you said the house was getting catified in finding new coordinates for nourishment. Thank you so much, Chris and Madhura. We'll come back to you. Maniza, we go to you now. All yours.
Hello. Thank you so much, Neil. Just a little overwhelmed from the last talk. I feel so Chris and Madhura's talk made me feel like I just had a plate full of kheer, just very, very sated, very warm. Thank you so much for that. But I think it's a perfect transition to ideas that I'd like to get into. So I'm going to share my screen. Is this visible? I'm hoping it is.
Yes, it is.
I'm going to present this. Okay, going to start once more. Salam, adab, and good evening. I think it's iftar time for those who are fasting at this point, which is sort of relevant to ideas I may get into later. But I know the title of the bits I'm going to share says Food and Eroticism, Cooking in a Love-Starved World. But I think more than cooking, I'm going to delve into rituals around meals and harvests and consumption. So think of it in a broader sense. And I think my perspective comes from a very internet-oriented space. So I don't think anybody should hesitate to Google certain terms I may use. Urban Dictionary is reliable, lots of hashtags, lots of internet trends. And I think that says a lot about me. I'm somebody who spends a lot of time on the internet, but I think as part of this session, I also recognize that apart from being a subject in the material world, I'm just as much a subject on the internet. And I'm going to start with hashtag cottagecore. So I will begin with the definition to set a little context. Unlike tradwives, a right-wing movement that advocates for regressive gender roles, cottagecore presents domesticity outside of the binary. People of any gender are invited to participate in the cottagecore's decidedly soft aesthetic, but women, in the most inclusive sense, are at the forefront. As Isabel Sloan wrote in New York Times, cottagecore offers a vision of the world where men are not consciously excluded, they're simply an afterthought. Perhaps this is why young queer women have embraced cottagecore with fervor. So cottagecore lesbians has nearly 33 million views. I wish I were on TikTok today. Offer more ideas on that, but it makes absolute sense. I think it's dominated popular culture for a while at least, because I've observed this trend growing in the last 5-ish years or so. On the screen, you will, I think, mood board here, a very popular one on Tumblr that was reblogged by lesbians, to whom who found this very appealing idea of this sort of pastoral space, not exactly separatist, but like a designated dream where you could just run away with your lesbian girlfriend or wife and grow a garden of your choice. Lyrics from Temptation explore the same idea. It's about desire. It's about wanting another person. It's about everything you might imagine the erotic to be, but it also adds in this long-term idea of sustenance, of harvesting desire over time. Let's grow a garden is where the emphasis is. And I think this connects to the next idea I want to talk about, sustenance, right? Why are sapphic? So I'm going to be using that word a lot. Sapphic communities, which I think loosely it denotes women who love women, trans women, queer women, non-binary femmes, try to see it through an inclusive lens. Though we can talk about how the internet excludes certain communities a bit later. But back to where I started, sustenance. The erotic vision for a lot of sapphic communities embodies this. It's about a continued commitment to letting the erotic bloom. I've actually copied dialogues from Haunting of Bly Manor here. There's a scene between two lovers where a moonflower becomes a metaphor for the blooming of desire. Jamie, who's in love with Danny, talks about how she spends a lot of time tilling her flowers, but they only bloom once. But I think that becomes a defining metaphor for the relationship between these two women. And I think this idea, at least this scene, has captured the imaginations of lesbian, cottagecore, sapphic communities online. And in many ways, we've tried to embody this in the best way we can. But connected to sustenance is the idea of abundance. Now, a lot of my own ideas borrow from Audre Lorde's The Uses of the Erotic. You'll notice that I'm going to be using words like erotic as opposed to sexual, because the erotic encompasses so much more than just the carnal, to put it very simply. Audre Lorde writes, "The erotic functions for me in several ways. The first is in providing the power, which comes from sharing deeply any pursuit with another person. The sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers, which can be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them, and lessens the thread of their difference. I also borrow from Adrienne Mary Brown's pleasure activism. Her idea of activism also encompasses pleasure. Why must organizing and activist work exclude the subject's pleasure? And that too extends beyond the sexual, right? Why I connect this with food is because food is so primary to our existence, to our sustenance. It feels like we live in a world where we're either engaging with the excess of food, right? Hyper-consumerist cultures, McDonald's, And then there's diet cultures, imposing fasting or maybe ritualistic fasting that also comes in the way of how we perceive food. I've also used the word abundance here, which has taken hold of Sapphic cottagecore communities online, as opposed to the excess, because the abundant is about what satisfies you, about what is just enough. And in many ways, activists, at least in the recent years, have tried to embody this, not simply as an aesthetic, but also as a means of living. We all know about the idea of throwing away what doesn't spark joy, but queerness hasn't been, like, at least in my reading of it in the recent years, queerness has engaged with minimalism for a bit, but I think we recognize that we're so fluid and there's so much happening within our communities that we can't be anything but maximalist, abundant, flamboyant, sometimes ornamental. And we pursue pleasure with a slow, process-oriented deliberation, especially Sapphic communities, in ways that perhaps we haven't done before, with greater access to food and variety and greater access. We're all trying to embody, not just in material ways, an abundant lifestyle, but also in the ways that we behave with each other. I want to get into the idea of aphrodisiacs. Now, we're shifting to the idea of popular culture and media. And this is more obviously about food that you consume. But if you've noticed, oysters, apart from sloppy, messy food, has become and is a very popular connector and mediator of romance between two characters, especially if they're lesbians or if they have sapphic tendencies. If you all watched Ratched, and I really recommend that you do, oysters, I mean, there's a scene between two characters where they're sharing oysters. One of them is having them for the first time. And a typical way in which another sapphic character introduces the other one to oysters is by describing the textures and flavors of it. One could also say that it's a bit of an innuendo, because blue is the warmest color, not my favorite film. The main character describes how oysters remind her of quote unquote something else, which is why she wants to initiate her love interest's journey or initiation into sapphism or lesbianism through the oyster. So the consumption of the oyster is not just food. There's another layer to it that a lot of media explores. Apart from that, there are contemporary poems and there's artwork that compares the idea of experiencing love, eroticism, and joy to the idea of experiencing food. I'm only going to read out the last two stanzas here, just so we get the feel of this poem by Becky Bertha. It always overwhelms me. Maybe you remember the day you discovered mangoes, when you and a friend fed thick, pulpy slices into each other, mouths open in astonishment. Maybe you remember your first taste and the startling comprehension of the possibilities of life in a world that included this incredible sweet reality. Right next to it is a comic that's obviously about a peach, and it connects the idea of consuming a peach to consuming the body of the beloved. These are just two examples of it, but lesbian poetry that connects with domesticity, that connects with food, fruit, items you have all around you, it's taken hold of lesbian imaginations, especially recently. I think it's a very good idea for all of us to maybe type in hashtag cottagecore or look up cottagecore lesbians. You will be flooded with media like this. In the interest of time, I will try to read just the last 3 stanzas here. This is a poem by Ellen Bass that has researched on the internet once again. The idea over here is once again the same. The beloved's body and the consumption of food become one. But you'll notice that in all these poems, there's this obsession with detail, much like the erotic lives of lesbians worldwide. There's no rush to get to a final orgasmic yes or an orgasmic union. It's this strange and curious buildup and exploration of flavors, textures, bodies, and ideas. Empty your basket of figs, spill your wine, that hard nugget of pain. I would suck it, cradling it on my tongue like the slick seed of pomegranate. I would lift it tenderly, as a great animal might carry a small one in the private cave of the mouth. I was reminded of how Audre Lorde talks about eroticism once again, but what appealed to me in all these texts is how the experience of the beloved's body is the same as the experience of food, almost like you're having it for the first time ever. And that takes us to the idea of the slow food movement, though we don't talk about it in theoretical terms. It feels like this too has made a resurgence, especially with COVID and the pandemic. We all developed new hobbies. We all decided that, maybe we all want to bake things. We all want to learn how to cook, the thing that our parents wanted us to, and never got the chance to sort of engage with the intricacies of rituals. But I've included 2 examples here because these are 2 very popular accounts online that connect, that I think at least my own community of Sapphic Muslims has really connected with. Now, food, I've pretty much added in a very safe for work photo here, explores nude photography and its intersection with food. So most of those images include women of diverse body shapes and types, and women of diverse orientations and gender identities, interposed with photos of gooey, luscious, ample-looking food. Because the idea is to not just sexualize different body types, but also emphasize on togetherness, on how the slow process-oriented preparation of these foods is like your reading of these bodies. I also included silbatta stories because I'm personally very fond of halib, a dish that contains within it so much, so many flavors and so many spices, a dish that holds erotic potential in it, but the kind that most of us haven't explored. And I know I'm entering a very culturally specific territory with this, but we'll explore that idea in a few minutes. And this connects more to, I think, my take on Muslim food cultures. So it's interesting that this talk is happening during the time of Ramadan, a time when I've actually had to reevaluate my own relationship with fasting and food, but I've included 2 images from queer Muslim accounts and queer Muslim collectives online. Reconstructed Mag is run by Shia queer Muslims from all over the world. But I appreciated this idea of Ramadan becoming a means of exploring spiritual nourishment, and fasting not as self-abnegation or deprivation, but more as this sort of separation from hyper-consumerism or the mechanization of time, how you don't have to engage with the excess, but what is abundant. It's very similar to what Adrienne Mary Brown proposes with her idea of the abundant, but I feel like when we speak of Ramadan or Muslim cultures, we very deliberately erase the eroticism that is inherent in how we practice life and rituals and aesthetics. The post on the right side is called Iftar Nights and Other Ramadan Stories. So this brought together poetry and prose around the idea of Ramadan. What's interesting is that all of them had to do with feasting rather than fasting. What everybody remembers is togetherness and humanity rather than divinity. How these moments and how these cultural spaces allow people to sit together at the same table and share and prepare food and ritualize what is important to them, be it duas, prayers, be it preparing tea or ruafza in the exact way that you've been taught by your mothers, be it toasting to the communities that you care for. And lately, among a lot of queer Muslim communities, queer Muslim iftars are an idea that have taken hold of our imaginations. And something new and interesting is happening there as compared to, I think it's very different from the idea of Ramadan that we've had, at least in the last decade. My own take on this has a lot to do with my relationship with fasting as a queer Muslim, because I've had to explore and reevaluate desire and food and consumption as I see it in my own life. I grew up believing that I had to deny myself of something, or that I had to suffer and grovel in order to receive rewards or to be worthy of love, whether it's from the divine or from my own community. But over time, I've come to realize that Ramadan can be what we as communities want it to be. I also bring over here a still from Portrait de la jeune fille en feu, because if you haven't watched this film, actually, I'm not going to go into the synopsis, I'll focus on this scene right here. I feel that domestic bliss has been explored beautifully over here, because in this scene, 3 women cook together and prepare a meal away from the bounds and regulations of society. They've been left alone for several days, and they've come to know each other's bodies in the most intricate ways that one can. 2 women are in love. Both of them have helped one of them get an abortion, which was an interesting idea to explore via period drama. And one of them is obviously complicit and helpful in making sure that the lovers get their own time together. But I think as I'm closing this, I need to know if I have more time. Yeah. As I'm closing this, I think I want to talk about why it feels important to me to emphasize on the slow, deliberate, process-oriented eroticism of food. Why is it so important to me? And why is it so important to Sapphic communities online? It connects with the idea of queer time. I think at the end of the day, most of us haven't experienced time in the milestone marked way that capitalist, heteronormative time expects us to. We are constantly aware of how we're running out of it. And maybe, just maybe, through these strange rituals that we create around food, around consumption, around love, maybe just through these, we get to pause, we get to reflect and slow time down, because we live with this anxiety in ways that perhaps cis hetero people don't. And I've included a still from Killing Eve over here because the last episodes explore domestic bliss between two lovers. And all those scenes are marked by rituals around food, around sharing French fries, around sharing wine and mugs. The mundane, the ordinary, and the domestic, all of which are about food. And I think I'd like to leave it at this note, because I feel that food, eroticism, are ways in which we not only indulge in love, but they're means through which we survive and become subjects in ways that we can understand in a love-starved world. I think I'm out of time, but this is it. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maniza, for your such a deep, varied, and appetizing trail into the erotic, and especially your insights on the slow food movement and fasting rituals. So I'm just going to pick up from that, and I have this question to ask all three of you. How do you think of indulgence, abundance, excess, and or the spectacular in relation to your personhood as queer individuals, and especially food enthusiasts? So whoever wants to take this first can go on.
I think I can address that in, again, a very random, fragmented way. So we're talking about the excess and the abundant. I feel like, so I think I have a very confusing relationship with food, at least on a personal note, because I think I grew up as a fat person for most of my life and still continue to exist as a fat person, at least through certain lenses. But it feels like the excess is also my way of reclaiming that, of reclaiming the space that I can take up as a queer person or a queer Muslim person on that note, because the space that I grew up in emphasized a lot on minimalism and fasting and denial, not just by the denial of food, but also through the ideas of abstinence, right? Sexual abstinence, denying yourself treats, visual treats, erotic treats, because indulgence is a sin, right? It's taken a while, at least for me, to override that and see it as a means to survive, and not as something, not as a gift I give to myself only when I deem myself worthy. I think when I was growing up, I came to recognize that I live in a somewhat godless universe, and that nobody's going to reward me for having suffered the way that I did, in whatever way I could define it as a melodramatic teen. But the thing about, I think, being Muslim and emerging from a conservative space is that you start to see yourself as too large for the world, almost. Like the world or certain domains cannot make spaces for you, that your want, your desire, and what you crave is bigger than what the world can give to you, or what people can give to you, or what you can give to yourself. So by engaging with cottagecore aesthetics or maximalist art or ideas, I feel like I'm able to celebrate my unending need for everything in life. That's my answer.
That was wonderful. Chris, Madhura?
Yeah, I think like when I think of abundance, really, I mean, for me, the question of excess is really also linked to capitalism, like the idea of the kind of consumption that is only extractive in nature and doesn't think of a relationship of reciprocity with nature. When I think of abundance, I really think in terms of working with nature in a way that is also caring of nature, for instance, thinking about waste, but also growing one's own food, thinking about seasons, thinking about the weather, to actually see the beauty of produce, to work with produce closely, and I think abundance is also milking its sensual and sensory aspects, like, when you work with food, when you work with fragrance, with textures, with tastes of different kind, and you rustle up things, you mix and match things, and you work with what you have. And in some ways, for me, abundance frankly comes also from constraint, because as a cook, as somebody who cooks, constraint is really what feeds my creativity. So for me, it is also that relationship. But I think, like, from the kind of middle class location that I come from, and I think Madhura should also speak for herself, excess is really about waste. And also, I mean, it's not something, it is about not knowing how to use all parts of something. And I think it is a lack of skill. I associate it with a lack of skill in the kitchen, in terms of the kitchen. I think she should.
I think actually both, you and Maniza covered some of those points of I think we need, in my head, I differentiate between excess and abundance, and this journey from understanding excess from a moral or political lens. Like in the beginning, as I said, in middle class households, excess is always morally frowned upon, right? You cannot waste things and those kinds of things. And as as we grew up, we went to the university, we sort of developed a political understanding. Excess also, as Chris said, got linked to capitalism, and that, so there was either a moral or a political lens. But I think to arrive at abundance and then its relationship to the body, or to then how you could be in sync with what is around you, I think that is a far more productive, robust than way to consider our relationship with the surrounding environment.
That's absolutely wonderful. I have so many more questions, but I can't in the interest of time. So we'll just take, I think, 2 questions from the audience. So you both have talked about the ebbs and flows of cooking, right? Cooking and intimacy. Do you think a desire to be involved with food, and you can articulate with what form and character desire means to you, do you think this desire tells us more about what it means to be South Asian, and especially what it means to be Indian today? A desire to be involved with food. Whoever wants to take this first.
I think I have a very short answer to this, though it might sound like it connects to ideas I've already shared before, but I think it certainly does, because I think when we look at the context we're situated in, right, we're talking about South Asian countries that while we experience food shortage, we also just have a very colorful cuisine, and it feels like our lives are incomplete without maybe excess spice or excess colors, or we're just very aesthetically abundant. That's where it starts. But I feel like, again, I could be wrong about this, because I think I'm still viewing this from a very typically Sunni Muslim lens. I feel like I think it really does connect. I'm going to center the idea of fasting here. I feel like with all that going on, and with religious waves that have taken over, I think, Indian politics, at least at this point, in history, fasting as part of religious rituals, it seems like the onus of suffering or the onus of self-abnegation lies on certain marginalized communities, or at least the effects of it are more pronounced on marginalized communities, be it women in the household fasting for the long lives of their husbands, be it poor Muslim households who fast while trying to work with 2 jobs. I think it just makes me think about how marginalized communities experience like the absence or the imposed sort of deprivation of food, whether it's through ritual or if it's voluntary. I think of that as opposed to how folks from powerful nations experience diet culture. Like it's very easy to have matcha avocado lattes for your health if you're not South Asian. Diet cultures mean something else here. We don't get to replace our diets with superfood. All we can do is cut things off because diet culture has a very restricted spectrum of what constitutes clean eating. And it also, I think this connects to the idea of what is dirty, right? Like clean eating cuts away a lot of food that is, I think, normalized in South Asian households. Suddenly you can't have the fatty bits on fish, and suddenly you're not allowed to have mutton, though it's so integral and necessary to memory and togetherness and belonging in at least the South Asian spaces that I've engaged with. So yeah, I think that was a bit random, but I was thinking about fasting once again.
Chris and Madhura, would you like to add something? Did you light go off?
Yes.
Gosh.
Suddenly a power outage. Thankfully, our internet still works, so we will
That's
still be
great.
there. But yeah, I think to quickly just respond to your question, I think if one is in South Asia, especially in India, in contemporary times, but actually why in contemporary times, I think in the whole, caste driven matrix of social organization in India, I think, desire for food was could never be divorced from the politics of it, right? And I think in today's world, even more so, of course, as we said, that we live in a context where it is becoming a source of violence, a source of where people are losing lives, right? So I think that kind of politics, that political understanding of food always underlies, at least for Chris and I, as both of us as practicing social scientists, Chris is a public health practitioner. I think it becomes impossible actually to neatly divide our desire from food from our political understanding of food. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question really.
No, that was absolutely fabulous. And we can, carry on with so much more. But I think we are out of time. Just 1 second quickly. I think we are out of time. But can we take one more question though? We'll just take one last question and then we'll wrap up. What do you understand, or how would you define utopia? Which is a very difficult concept or term to grapple with. But in relation to your own methods and strategies of cooking, what is utopia to all of you? And we'll end with that question. Oh, your electricity came back. Nice. Would you like to go first?
I'm not sure if, at least at my end, I was hoping Chris would go first because it feels like that's a very, oh my gosh, utopias are so abstract and expansive. It's like asking us what we want to do with our futures when they're so uncertain. But I think I can come up with, I think I have a very vague sense of how I'd think of an ideal world. Phil, my entire, I think, talk was engaging with that idea. Cottagecore, sapphic, vaguely separatist realities are a pastoral utopia of sorts. But I think I do think of a future where, yeah, I think it pretty much wraps up the ideas I've already shared. A future that is abundant, that is fluid, that is free. A future where I think fasting means something else, and nourishment it addresses the soul or the mind or body in more intricate and integral ways as compared to how we define those ideas now. A utopia chucks away diet culture, and we live in a world that's more accepting of actually a world that blurs or does away with ideas of what is pure and clean and what is dirty or excessive. Yeah, I think that's my very personal take on it.
I think like for me, the idea of utopia is very much like a world in which there's like a close connection with nature, with growing food, with abundance, with animals.
And also slowness, actually, taking from what Maniza brought up, right? Just the slowness of things.
Yeah. Yeah, and a life in which like a good life, like a life feeling free and feeling respected and feeling being able to feel your own self, like, to have, through slowness, have that sensual and sensory experience of the world. That I think that would be utopia. I mean, that would at least be some elements of the utopia that I aspire to.
I think that was wonderful, and I'm not sure how much of an utopia we can experience in this country, given the times we are in. But it's so nice to keep thinking about these moments and keep thinking about these cultures and strategies. And it was so nice to have three of you here today, and hopefully we can do sometime again soon some of these conversations. Thank you so much. We'll go on to our next panel. And I'll hand it over to Shrija, who will be moderating this. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you to everyone else who just presented previously. We're ending the conference with a wonderful last panel. Our first panelist is Shakuntala, who works on modern global fiction with a focus on politics of food and modernity. Having taught a variety of courses across departments such as women, gender and sexuality studies, critical social inquiry, social thought and political economy, she's committed to examining interdisciplinary, transnational and innovative teaching and writing practices. Some of her published essays can be found in journals such as Feminist Review and Journal of Commonwealth Literature. Thank you. Shakuntala is actually having trouble with internet. I hope she can join us shortly. But our second panelist is Hurmat ul-N. She's a Pakistani artist and scholar. She's a PhD student with the Theatre and Performance Studies program at York University. She holds an MFA in performance art from the School of Art Institute, Chicago, where she was studying as a Fulbright scholar. Ain is interested in discourse around the body and its representation in media and arts Through her practice, she explores identity and gender roles in context of sociopolitical rules of acceptability and sacrilege. We're really glad to have you both here. But let me quickly brief the format once again. Each speaker takes 15 minutes for the presentation, after which I will pose a question and we'll have a 10-minute moderated discussion. And then we'll take questions from the audience. Thank you so much, and over to you, Hurmat.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Shuja. I'm just going to share the screen. Just making sure we can all see.
Yeah, it's visible.
Awesome. Thank you. And so before I launch into the presentation, I would just like to say that I'm really, really grateful to be here today. Since yesterday, I've been listening to all these conversations, and I'm just so like overwhelmed, but also so delighted for this conversation that we are a part of together. Also, a small disclaimer, I'm not feeling that great. My voice kind of lets go of me temporarily. I hope it doesn't happen during the presentation, but please bear with me. And now we're going to launch straight into the presentation. All right. So my presentation today is part of a longer paper, which I am writing, still in the process of, for a film conference. And it's part of my coursework that I'm doing at my university. In the paper, I'm reading Meesha Shafi's song and video, Hot Mango Chutney Sauce, through the lens of feminist movement in Pakistan and a queer futurity theory by Jose Esteban Munoz, who's a Cuban cultural theorist. I'm interested in the stark contrast of the world portrayed in the song to the actual reality in Pakistan right now. I read the video as a work of resistance against the backdrop of political unrest, hostility in public spaces, violence against women, trans women, and minoritarian subjects. We can watch a little bit of the song for those of us who are not familiar with what happens or what the song is about, because I'm going to be doing a closed reading of the first few scenes. So, it will be sort of useful to have a first visual on it.
Brunch at hers is always a disaster. Last time I went, I said, okay, I see a lot of samosa, but where are the mimosas? Why are you so jealous? Tere aansu mangi umbrellas. Why are you?
All right. So the opening shot of the video frames Meesha Shafi on a billboard against a nighttime busy road in Lahore. Obviously, in actuality, she's in Toronto here. So this is an important kind of conversation or like a thread that I follow in the paper where I talk about the relationship of like her absence and presence in Lahore and being in Toronto, and what that means to this whole idea of framing utopia. But in the interest of time, for this particular presentation, I don't go down this path. So she, in this shot, in the scene, she borrows a very old-timer folk tongue twister as the introductory lyrics of the song. Clearly, the shot of the road responds to the situation described in the tongue twister. Chandu ke chacha ne chandu ki chachi ko chutney chatai. The road shot cuts to the next scene of a truck parked next to a roadside chai ka dhaba. Both the truck and dhaba are lined with neon lights and customary embellishments. The colors of the light are resonating in costumes, accessories, props, all that. The entire scene and most of the rest of the video is an elaborate carnivalesque design, staying true to the defining characteristics of Bakhtin's ideology. The diegetic space of the video is a night of no accountability, where the characters continue to move, sing, and dance at the dhaba and in the back of the truck. The cheery, joyful, and frivolous conduct of the women against the satirical verses of the song mock the status quo, the powerful, the rich, the center. Time and again, we see scenes in the video which, when paired with provocative repetition of the lyrics, evoke an unsettling melancholy, masked as over-the-top cheerfulness. Consider, for example, the circus carousel lighting framing the title text box and then the billboard. The chintz pattern in Shafi's sari and the wallpaper behind her. The talking suspended head of Lena Auntie from Swinery. There are many representational motifs which are familiar yet absurd at the same time, like the carnivalesque. In the original paper, I go to talk about the truck filled with mangoes as an escape vehicle. I also refer to symbolic escapism, drawing parallels of the truck to gypsy caravans on a quest for an alternate future. I make connections with Shilpa Patke's article, Defending Frivolous Fun, and I argue in favor of reclaiming public spaces while drawing likeness to campaigns such as Girls at Dhabas from Karachi. However, today, I want to focus on select aspects of the song and video in connection to this conference's theme. So back to Munoz. Jose Esteban Munoz expands on Marcuse's great refusal. And I quote, "Queerness, as I'm describing it here, is more than just sexuality. It is this great refusal of a performance principle that allows the human to feel and know not only our work and our pleasure, but also ourselves and others." And this quote is from Just Like Heaven. Munoz proceeds to speak about queer aesthetic functioning like a great refusal because of its political potential and of art in general to change reality itself. The lyrics of the song reiterate that mango chutney with a simple meal of dal and rice is sufficient to live a grateful life of pleasure. The song argues against the mainstream capitalist and material culture. Nevertheless, it perpetuates a strong preference for consumption, references to food and indulgence. The song is a celebration of a way of life, simple pleasures, and popular objects. The chai cups and the pakola bottle are not just props in the hands of the actors. These are actual drinks being consumed. The girls in the dhaba scene are shown drinking chai. Abdullah Siddiqui is shown drinking pakola straight from the bottle, having dropped the straw from the earlier scene. But there is a teacup and saucer in Shafi's hand too, which she does not drink from. In fact, she has a little moment of not knowing where to place the cup behind her on the table, and I suspect somebody took it from her hand right outside where the shot gets cut. I'm totally invested in these details. They constantly remind us of pop art, Munoz has argued that pop art is an act of disidentification from commodity culture by artists like Andy Warhol. According to the Warholian philosophy, radical democracy is only possible through the door of mass production. The mass-produced object is a moment of connection in an estranged world driven mad by greed and consumerism. Munoz spends some time writing about the Coca-Cola bottle drawing by Warhol. Sorry, here. The relationality of the bottle and flower, a symbol of queer utopianism. For it's not just a soda bottle, it has been customized, personalized, touched by a blooming flower. I'm going back to what Maniza was talking about earlier. In Shafi's video, the Pakola bottle does a similar thing. Now, Pakistan Cola, Pakola, in its true nationalistic spirit, was released on 14th of August, 1950, like a mere few years after the partition itself. It has a success story as flashy as its neon green color. From setting up of the first ever soda factory in Pakistan at that time, to the winning formula of vanilla cream and rose water, and the nationalistic branding. Pakola was an identity marker for Pakistan at the time, until its initial fame was wiped out clean, by Pepsi and Coca-Cola in 1979. Yet it has done a few rounds of recurrence since then. So here, watch the only male character in Shafi's video registering his character and claiming his identity through the sweet green drink. Queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. That's Munoz for you. Going back to the Chachiko chutney chatai, what qualifies as a chutney? I mean, we understand that chutney is a condiment which acts on two levels. Its viscosity and sauce-like state is an important qualifying feature. So is its flavor combination, often sour and sweet, sweet and spicy, some arrangement of a fruit or vegetable with spices, and pickling. Now, pickling, this brings us to the act of preserving through pickling, jamming, chutney dalna. It's a very specific use of Urdu Hindi language associated with achar and chutneys only, both referring to the performance and procedure of pickling. Another exclusive use of language to do with chutney is part of the tongue twister earlier, chutney chatai. Chutney chatana is not like chakhana. Chakhana is to give a taste of, but the former one, chutney chatana, is to give a lick, a small, quick, checking it kind of a lick. The etymology of the word chutney itself derives from chatna, to lick. Perhaps we can call it the licked, the lickable, and that is to build appetite. In both cases, the use of the language is very performative and mimetic of the use of mouth and tongue in specific. In the song, the mango chutney is hot. Hence, it makes sense that it can only be consumed in small quantities. The lyrics in the song paint an image of the hot chutney against lips adorned with gloss, evoking an embodied and even visceral imagination in us. The shot in the video with eating mangoes is an example of this frequent attention and humorous, bold, mildly exaggerated focus on the mouth. I say mildly because there is no other way to eat mangoes. In this video, the mouth is shown to talk, sing, mock, lick, laugh, to speak up, and to speak out. The food is rendered as a medium of indulgence and earned pleasure and a guiltless consumption. Food is also a metaphor to speak about body, identity, space, and belonging. The conversation started within the space of portrayal of body and food, points towards claiming the right to allow body to exist outside of conformist, binary, heteropatriarchal roles. In Shafi's world, chutney is a literal mashup of thought, ideas, and a possibility of flavors, very much like the chutney music genre, which is a merger of Bhojpuri folk singing and Indo-Caribbean soca music. Perhaps that also comes from this idea of flavors merging. Queer utopianism is a mode of desiring. It is an alternate possibility, helping us escape from the mundanity of the present. And the aesthetics, art, film, Shafi's video, is a way of imagining this likelihood. The video allows us to view an alternate world where a nocturnal soiree of beautiful young women dancing in the back of a truck in Lahore is completely plausible. A world that uses chutney as a craving, a performance, a gesture, slightly lewd one. The diegetic space of the video is a space of resistance because it portrays a utopian future where the nocturnal public space has already been claimed. It's a portrayal of a world where right to your own body, to safety, to fun and dance is not being negotiated. The right to space is placed next to the simple, everyday pop culture objects of mundanity, like snacks, food, and chai. And that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Hurmat. And I'm really glad that we also sort of moved beyond the conceptualization of queerness as not just an embodied identitarian sort of concept, but even the chutney being a performance of queerness in a lot of ways. And actually, Shakuntala isn't here yet because her connection is, so we're going to be chatting for a while, and I hope that's okay. And I'm going to pick up from the video that you showed us.
Sorry, she's here.
She's here? Okay, great.
Oh,
that's
wonderful.
Yeah, lovely. Shakuntala? Hi. Hope you're okay.
I'm all good. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. You're just on time also. So I think I'll just hand it over to you. Hurmat just finished.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's something going on with my building. Am I on? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, you're perfectly audible.
Okay. So sorry. It's such a pleasure to be here, to be part of this feasting. And also for your patient and warm communication throughout. There've been multiple missed communication and delays. It just doesn't start with you, Srija, it starts with Neil as well. So my warm thanks to Neil for having the perfect affect on email and on Zoom as well. Thank you for your patience again, everybody. I just got a little thrown off by my internet connection. That's the part of the transnational experience, I'm guessing, the part of the Zoom experience. I hope I am not even sure. I might be a little out of breath or I might be a little disoriented. So forgive me if I come across as a little scrambled. Am I behind time at all, Srija, or did I just make it?
That's okay. I think you have 15 minutes.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to share screen. Oh, hang on a second. I'm not gonna, 1 second. All right, so I guess it might be just destined that I'm going last, because whatever little I heard from the first few panelists, they were talking so much about the erotics of pleasure, of abundance, of joy, that I fear I'm taking it into a completely I'm taking it into a completely different direction, into almost like the erotics of slumming and erotics of disgust. So it might be just something that that happened by chance. Like I'm the one who goes at the very end, because my topic is in the classic sense distasteful, in terms of like if we kind of translate disgust, but at the same time it's trying to find meaning in it. I'm calling it Unruly Tastes, and I'm looking at actually the realm of this growing body of new Anglophone literature. And it's like, so I'm going to jump straight into it. So recent New York Times article on the psychology of disgust claims, if you manage to complete a single day without experiencing any form of disgust, you're either a baby or in a coma. Yet how many of us are really aware of our everyday attunements to disgust? There is no doubt that the tropes of food and eating saturate current writing by South Asian authors today. And some recent cultural productions do suggest that food has become a trite means of depicting South Asian identity. However, food is not just a favored trope or an easy trope or metaphor in the literature, but it is critical to matters of identity and its contestation, a contestation that often gets centered around what one can literally stomach. And what one can literally stomach when it comes to questions of not just what one eats, but how it is prepared, not what food is, but what it means, who has prepared it for you or for whom you've prepared it, and where. So I'm interested in the ways that a shared cultural language and learned habitus of food, despite immense diversity, of course, re-enters and gets creatively reformulated within the landscape for growing queer Anglophone fiction. And I'm also interested in how it is pushing against or staying within the limits of an often flattened, elitist, translated literature, a literature that Salman Rushdie would call as bastardized fiction. So what I soon begin to notice while I'm looking at this body of work is like these multiple references to feelings of outcastness, uncleanness, experiences of impurity and contamination as a significant recurring pattern and theme. This makes me wonder as to how the presence of food here in this fiction is being used to problematize ostensibly familiar discourses surrounding purity, pollution, and disgust. I'm talking about them as ostensibly we think we understand, but they're deeply intersectional, they're multiply palimpsested. And given as psychologists on disgust, say Paul Rozin, or anthropologists on disgust, such as Mary Douglas would argue, this purity complex is fundamentally tied to issues of food. So that's where this questioning is born. Now, as has been discussed before, subcontinental queer identity is considered multiply abject in colonial, imperialist, nationalist, and diasporic contexts. And it has more than a fraught relationship with various contradictory discourses of purity and pollution. So now how does food get into this already, or play into this already anxious relationship with, say, ideas of being out of place? Now, if there's a shared cultural understanding of food, we all know that there's this understanding that we are what we eat. If we are what we eat, then impure food conduct becomes a predictor of impure sexual conduct. And through this logic and through this thread, sensory excess becomes a marker of sexual inferiority or sexual outsiderness. So if purity is often policed and coded via the gustatory and sexual in routine, everyday, nondescript ways in the culture, then it becomes important to map and trace these in cultural representations, lest they be dismissed as something trivial and mundane, or in this case, conversely, as something outlandish and ridiculous, as manifestations of the rare and exceptional. So keeping all of this in mind, I put these two aspects, the idea of the gustatory and the idea of the sexual, in conversation with each other within these modern literary texts, queer texts that are coming up in literature. And the texts that I choose are basically R. Raj Rao's novel, The Boyfriend, and Neil Mukherjee's novel, A Life Apart. And these are new texts. They're all from the 2000s. Now, in much of philosophy, religion, and literature, writes the political scientist Janet Fleming, food is associated with ideas of body, animal, female, and appetite, things that civilized men have sought to subjugate with knowledge and reason. However, in both colonial and Indian nationalist discourses, the male subject is also seen as suspect when it comes to questions of unnatural sexual appetite and sensory access. Therefore, for the purpose of this talk, I'm interested in questions of the fashioning of queer male identity. In particular, I'm looking at not just the queer male identity, I'm looking at an elite queer Brahmin male identity. Now, a question may arise as to why the interest in this particularly, this liminally privileged protagonist as he navigates all things food. Now, it's because his identity is historically positioned at the apex of the purity complex. And by virtue of his gatekeeper status, he's considered to be the most anxious about and invested in approaches to proper ingestion and respectable desire. So then the question becomes, how does modern Anglophone queer fiction that we are seeing, fiction written in English, fiction written by elites for elites, how does this kind of fiction undo hegemonic constructions of purity through the eyes of such a protagonist, rather through his tastes? So, but first, a brief summary of these two texts for those of you who haven't read these novels. And I understand that we have such a diverse group here and so many disciplines jostling in this space that for the sake of everybody, I'm going to give a very visual telling of what food is doing in these novels as well, as opposed to relying on just say direct quotations. So that's the creative liberty I'm taking with these slides. So in summary, in The Boyfriend, that is the one with R. Raj Rao, we follow the story of an unsuccessful relationship between a 40-year-old gay journalist, his name is Yudi, with a much younger 19-year-old untouchable peon, Milind Madik. Now, Yudi feels betrayed by his lover, who abandons him for a marriage to a woman at the end of the novel, yet he finds a way to also accept him back into his life, even though in a very compromised and unequal manner. In Neil Mukherjee's A Life Apart, Rithwik, who's the main Brahmin protagonist, upper class, not upper class actually, but class-wise liminally positioned, is shown to escape Kolkata and his extended family to pursue a higher degree in Oxford, England, but then by some odd, almost like he's fated to become this illegal immigrant when his UK visa expires and he doesn't even try to get absorbed into the normal workforce. We are shown that Rithwik is spending his days writing his novel, and he's taking intimate care of an incontinent and alcoholic elderly British landlady, Anne Cameron. But at night, what's happening is he's also pursuing abjection through pursuits like prostitution, dangerous encounters that ultimately expose him to violence and death. So none of these novels have neat or happy endings. And they're actually showing these themes and explorations of a willing movement and a willing immersion in the idea of degradation. So Yudi unequivocally claims in The Boyfriend, homos are no different from Bhangis. Both are untouchables. I am a homosexual, gay by caste, gay by religion. Ritwik pushes back against his namesake that stands for a Brahmin pure peace priest who officiates at sacrifice through his various involvements with ideas of taboo. Now, such declarations are, of course, put to practical test within the novels, primarily through matters of taste and touch. So how do these authors show this willing exploration, this immersion, as it were, into of degradation, really, or abjection through food and sex? I noticed three primary ways in which this is happening. So I'm doing a close reading of food in the way that food gets read in the culture, holistically, in a macro way, as opposed to a disparate fragmentary way. So I noticed they're working, food and sex are working in conjunction with each other, sometimes intersecting, but at the same time, like they are participating in the organizing principle and logic of the textual universe. So the three primary ways that this is happening is through these characters, the authors are showing a reconfiguration of the public impure and the private pure ideas of eating. That's the first way. The second way is that they're showing this unambiguous pursuit of taboo through food and sex, through commensality. And the third thing is that they're showing constantly these parallels and intersections between sexual and gustatory through a sensory interface, through like coming back to the idea of senses and body and touch, as opposed to a theoretical framing. So now, this idea of private and public are central to the way food is imagined in India. And some of our previous panelists have already shown this. The private inner sphere is actually a modern day construction, is a modern nationalist construction, as Dipesh Chakraborty, Partha Chatterjee will attest, that this is a space that got created as an anti-colonial, decolonial space. It's a creative space for shoring cultural purity, for upkeeping traditions, celebrating the spiritual, the sacred, and also like performing purity. So that was the significance, and that has been the continuing significance of this private inner sphere. The most people sometimes think that the private sphere comes from a much more ancient time, this construction of the private sphere. The public, in contrast, is a space of ambiguity, pollution, violence, anonymity, disconnection. Now, theorists such as Gayatri Gopinath and Anita Manor have previously shown that queering focuses a lot on this private space, how to queer it from within, this idea of disidentification from within, the idea of reclamation of this space as queer subject. So when I came to these novels, I was expecting to find some kind of trying to find entry back into the space of purity, the space of supposed decolonization. But what I find is that actually there's a sharp and decisive movement away from the space of the domestic and the private sphere. Suddenly, these characters are shown to be engaging with, they are completely not engaging with any aspect of home. They live separately, they live alone, even as upper caste only sons. They are far away from their extended family. And they are ordering their everyday consumption through Chinese takeaways, through local dabbawalas, through visiting Irani cafes, through going to underground gay bars. They're also they're engaging in very unusual commensality, that is with strangers, with people that they barely know, across caste, across class, across all sorts of like transnational divides, for instance, as well in the case of Ritwik, right? So when they're performing food in this way and abandoning the private sphere and going towards the public sphere as the space of connection, as the space of diversity, of experimentation, what they're really doing is that they're reconfiguring the space of the public as the space of freedom, liberation, as opposed to the private space of, say, they're constructing the private as something which is limiting, which is confined, which is kind of immature, which is infantile in the way that they're talking about food. In the way that they're constructing even home food. There's no celebration of culinary nostalgic identity. There's no celebration of home food, mother's food. There's an absolute alienation from the private sphere. So suddenly it makes the reader stop and say, wait, what is happening here? Why is the private suddenly becoming a space of redundancy, a space of alienation, a space of stagnation? And this public male homosocial space is being reclaimed as the space of, let's say, adventure and strange excitement and a jostling in a bizarre, ambiguous space kind of thing. Of course, the authors are also pointing out that these characters are not engaging in ways that are typically westernized. They're not going to glamorous neoliberal venues. They're not going to gentrified spaces. They are seeking the marginal. They are seeking the anonymous. They are seeking, in some ways, the subaltern. They are seeking the subaltern spaces of the city. So this is part of some of the stuff that they're engaging in. Tobacco. Ritvik is learning how to cook British food, taboo food in terms of like the way there's so many beef dishes that you can see. He's tasting Middle Eastern food. He's regularly having food with his Pakistani neighbors. So the Brahminical taboo idea is completely being thrown out of the window. Now, this is also something that they're doing not just unconsciously. They're saying that this is part of their queer positionality. They're equating this approach towards the public and the private as connected to their queer positionality. Now, interestingly, the way the protagonists perform food is also how they approach desire and sexual intimacy. So you would ask, like, why, how does that paralleling happen? Now, Yudi, that is the character in The Boyfriend, is cruising for sex in abject public spaces, such as Mumbai's public male toilets, in the same way that Ritvik is pursuing cottaging in toilets as an addiction in London. In addition, both get romantically involved with forbidden men, Yudi with the Dalit youth, Milind and Ritvik with an older Muslim arms trading Zafar. This embracing of taboo is not wholly intellectual, as I mentioned before. It is shown to begin at the level of the bodily and the aesthetic, at the level of the sensory. That's where it starts. So both Yudi and Ritvik are drawn to the sensory aspect of the unsavory. In surprising depictions of non-normative desire, Mukherjee, for instance, that is Neil Mukherjee, the author, describes a typical sexual encounter of cottaging for Ritvik as based in how physically unattractive his potential sexual partner is. So I'm going to read out a quote. The thought of disease keeps dipping and circling in Ritvik's head. He marks how unattractive the man is. Short, pale, with small eyes, jowls, and a terrible and impossibly black mustache. And he knows, with an almost pathological sense of sureness, that he's going to have sex with that man. Ritvik equates his pursuit of forbidden sexual encounters as a growing thrill. The danger present in abject encounters is presented as a complex spicing that Ritvik sensorially grows to relish, even if it puts him at mortal risk. So in Rao's depiction of Yudi's first encounter with Milind, the author is painting a similar erotic interest based in disgust. I'm going to wrap up a little quickly because we are a little behind time. Now, such alternative portrayals of desire and appetite signal a different aesthetic. One that is based in one that takes the normatively disgusting as a point of entry and engagement. Now, previous scholarship on disgust has investigated how disgust can be deployed as a positive aesthetics. Carol Corson-Mayer writes that emphasis on the ways in which disgust becomes a part of deep aesthetic apprehension of difficult experiences, including some that might even qualify as beautiful and even more surprisingly as delicious, must be taken into consideration. As seen in the depiction of Ritwik and Yudhi's encounters with everyday taboo, disgust inspires fascination and absorption. There's a certain intensity of experience in the shift from aversion to attraction that both protagonists find pleasurable and edifying. These portrayals point towards the paradox of inversion, the mystery of why we willingly seek out experiences that deliver unpleasantness, even pain and suffering. Both protagonists seek this intensity of feeling as something life-affirming and meaningful. They're shown to be paradoxically drawn to abject experiences through taste and touch as the path to finding love and liberation from stifling norms that stand in the way of true intimacy, or basically they're choosing embodiment over idealization and abstinence. Interestingly, these observations regarding the positive and liberating aspects of the pursuit of the disgusting is not just coming from Western critics. We are finding them from present in marginalized religious philosophical traditions from the subcontinent too, as in the case of certain kinds of tantric practices, the left path of Tantra, as well as say the Ghoris, Kapalikas, who have experimented with taboo sex and taboo illicit sex and taboo food as the way towards liberation. So what is this kind of literature trying to do through the subtle shifting of the circuitry of disgusting in the everyday? To show disgust as a positive, as a fundamental entry point into intimacy, especially within an elitist, dissonant literature space, means the authors are radicalizing disgust in secular, anonymous, non-ritualized, non-stylized, non-fetishized ways. And this amounts to the proposal of an alternate aesthetic and ethics, which defies attributions of weakness, religiosity, westernization, or knee-jerk animal reactivity. Why is this important? An undermining of disgust from within that destabilizes the fixed and uniform norms as having intellectual coherence based in biological truth, supposedly, as a site not one of immediate aversion and avoidance, but one of sought-after erotic value and deliberate, disciplined connection based in agency and choice, is important to reiterate in queer post-colonial fiction, especially since the insistence on the universal nature of disgust has often led to the masking of bias and the criminalization of homosexuality in many countries. In conclusion, we see that this global Anglophone fiction is trying, even within its limits, even through its flatness, through the deliberate pairing of food and sex, it's trying to come across, provide a contestation and creation of identity that could be best perceived as revelatory, reparative, and radical. So thank you. I tried to make that as short as possible. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much, and I'm sorry to catch you off guard about the time, but
no worries.
And I'm really glad that you could make it, because I think missed Hurmat's, but your session really also complemented what Hurmat was talking about, where in hers it's almost a utopian sense of futurity about queerness. There's the carnivalesque, and she brings up Jose Munoz, whereas I think yours is also a reminder that queer utopia is not entirely devoid of abject bodies and abjection in general. So thank you so much. I'll pose a quick question, and either of you can take it. So mine was mostly about form, because I thought that form sort of comes up in both your presentations. And it's interesting that form is also fundamental to food and literature alike. So I'm thinking especially of also the hot mango chutney sauce video that Hurmat was showing, where there is a multiplicity at the linguistic, temporal, and visual levels. So I was thinking, how do you think that form sort of interrupts, enables, or even disrupts narratives of queerness, food, and literature? And do you think that this performance of form has anything to do with South Asian narratives particularly? Right? So that's my question, and either of you can take it.
Okay, I can go first. I would actually be very interested to hear what Shakuntala has to say about that from like a literature and point of view. I think about that often because like I'm essentially a performance artist, and I think about visual and performativity before I think about words and text, and I sometimes feel like food, for example, because I mean that's what we're here doing here today. It sort of has this kind of like, it's sort of like body in the sense that when you talk about it or when you show it through different forms and different mediums, and it appears in different ways, whether it's on the screen or whether it's in, as an everyday object in your life, and you don't necessarily kind of glamorize it that much, it really shifts a lot. And yet there is this kind of like multimodality to the experience that you can have just by shifting a little bit about the form. What I would just like to mention here very briefly is, this idea of, since the pandemic, especially existing on this platform that we're right now, and that, and talking about food, it's sort of like this constant paradox of push and pull about like what we're doing, how we're trying to do it. We're trying to keep abreast with something, yet wouldn't we just all love to be able to taste something in, like in an embodied experience form, and not to undermine what we're able to do here, because like the people you're able to bring together because of the platform of using, so there's this constant kind of absence and presence and constant kind of loss and gain. The same way that, food is, so I sometimes feel that there is a bit of like over glamorization that happens, especially to do with food on like Instagram, on this kind of like this whole culture of like photographing food, making videos of food, that takes us away from the experience that, today, in the earlier presentation when Chris and Madhvi were talking about, like the actual experience of what it means to be there, present in person. I'm just going to stop here and let Shakuntala take over. Yeah.
You're doing such a marvelous job of articulating so many complex things there. So I was like, I'm ready to piggyback on whatever you're saying and say that basically food endlessly gives itself to form, various forms. And that's the beauty of food. It just keeps on, it's so transformative, it's so malleable, it's so shifting and in flux, but yet at the same time underlying it, as say, I'm noticing like, anthropologists are saying, or structuralists are saying, that there are certain fundamental components to how food works as language. Or how food is creating a certain kind of very nuanced communication, which is a shared and understood communication, embodied communication as such, as Hurmat was saying, and as the previous panelists have shown, literally, there's this embodiment aspect to it as well. So it's a wonderful language which has so many modalities, again, as Hurmat was saying. So that's why, how does it push against something like the fiction that I'm reading, which cannot encapsulate a lot of vernacular nuance or regional identity? A lot of things there are lots of gaps, there's lots of slips, and you wish that food is actually much more generative than the language of the fiction itself. So it's stretching and it's pushing against that, and you can see that tension. And that's where I'm really interested in seeing where these slippages are happening. Where are we missing some of the significances of food that we could catch but certain forms don't have that container yet, which food does. So again, yes, proliferating forms, internet, for instance, new ways of sharing recipes, new ways of doing food. So yeah, the future is only going to get more and more delicious and tasty in our experiments with form.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have, I think, we'll take a quick question from the audience as well. We have time for around one question. And this is on terms of like contamination, authenticity, purity, to pick up from Shakuntala's presentation. So we have, with the advent of globalization, we've witnessed an amalgamation of cuisines and cultures. And this idea of quote unquote authentic food as being purely belonging to an identity is sort of constantly challenged, right? And that is to say that food is a mix of varied elements, cultures, intersections, and performances. So does this mean that all food is queer because all food transgresses dominant ideologies of originality, to speak? Yeah. Again, either of you can.
Okay, I can start. I would say, like, the short answer is I would say yes. Why not? I think, you know, again, I'm sort of like pushing against this kind of Munoz's reading of like we're all queer. Like, why not? That space of existence or space of potentiality is so much freer. It's so much. There's more air to breathe. You know. And the same goes for food, although we do understand that almost like all other structures of overbearing fundamentalism, patriarchy, all of that, food also has done that. Like it has been made to, let's just say. But the fact that there is an room for reclamation, there is room to take back and to, you know, to kind of like own or to share. I would say that's a very queer potentiality that, you know, food presents us with over our own like selves, our lives, our futures. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this understanding of queerness, this realization of queerness of food inherently and our positionality would actually be useful in the ways that it can undermine power, in the ways that we have very fixed ideas and very like inflexible ideas of what is cuisine, what is identity, what is authenticity. So it works as a realization that we need to work towards, and many of us may not have yet, but it's something that is in process and in progress, and with more evolution in our own positions, in our own politics, eventually the future and the present and the past has been queer. So yes.
I think with that, we come to an end. Thank you so much. Despite unruly connections, we've managed to stick around. So thank you so much, both of you, for being here. I'll just call over Neil to sort of wrap up the conference. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Srija, and thank you, Shakuntala and Hurmat, for such a wonderful end to the conference today. And thank you to all the speakers on both days who agreed to do this in rather very short time. I'm also thankful to the audience who came for these 2 days and made the event much more engaging and fruitful. This is our first foray into a conference that is about food in relation to queerness. And, you know, I mean, it's just so satisfying to think of food in multiplicities and as multiplicities, from a trek to our colonial past, to trails, into the spices, into the spaces we inhabit today, the affective, the objective, the culinary conjunctions that we find ourselves into. It's just been a marvelous affair, and of course, a very delicious affair as well. Thank you so much again, and we hope to do a bigger one next time. Until then, keep following us on our Instagram page, CSGS_Ashoka. And with that, we'll take you leave. Have a very good weekend ahead. Thank you.